Once again, the internet is warning us that a healthy habit might actually be harming us. And the latest scare is about tea. Are you actually brewing up a cup of microplastics and heavy metals and chemical additives? Let's take a closer look. Welcome to the Nutrition Diva podcast, a show where we take a closer look at nutrition news, research, and trends so that you can feel more confident about what you eat. I'm your host, Monica Reinagel, and today I want to address a question that has been popping up in my inbox a lot lately. Are tea bags leaching harmful chemicals into our beverages? And if so, what can we do about it? Concerns about microplastics, heavy metals, and chemical additives in tea bags have been making the rounds online, and it's got a lot of people wondering whether this comforting daily ritual might actually be doing more harm than good. Honestly, I'm not surprised that these warnings are getting so much traction. There's a weird sort of schadenfreude that seems to come up whenever a supposedly healthy habit is alleged to have a dark side. I think the internet loves nothing more than to take our sources of comfort and turn them into sources of stress. But as you might have guessed, the real story is a little more nuanced, a little less sensational. There are some legitimate concerns here, but I don't think we need to toss out our entire tea collection. So today, let's take a closer look at the nature of these purported hazards, what the risks might be, and most importantly, put all of this into perspective. Now, you may have noticed that I just used both the words hazard and the word risk. And you might be wondering, is there actually a difference between those two things? And there is a difference, and it's an important one. In fact, I devoted an entire episode to the difference between these two things. It was episode number 355, if you'd like to check that out. But here's the short version. A hazard is something that has the potential to cause harm. And a risk is the likelihood that it actually will cause harm, given how we typically interact with it. So, as an example, a toaster is an electrical hazard, but the risk of getting electrocuted while making toast is pretty low, assuming that we're using it properly, as in not in the bathtub. So in terms of tea bags, some of the components in certain tea bags may indeed pose hazards, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they present a significant risk to your health, especially in the amounts and the contexts that we're talking about. So let's take a look at what the science actually shows, and we'll start with microplastics, seeing as that seems to be getting the most attention lately. Recent studies have found that certain types of tea bags, such as those silky pyramid-shaped tea bags you've probably seen, these kinds of tea bags can release millions or even billions of microplastic particles into a single cup of tea. While that's a much higher concentration than we find in most other foods, keep in mind that these particles are measured in nanograms. That is 1/1000th of a gram. And to put that into perspective for you, a single grain of table salt weighs about 60 million nanograms. So we're talking about an extremely small amount by weight. But the real question is whether consuming these tiny particles poses a health risk. And at this point, the answer is we're not sure. Microplastics have been shown to cross into cells in lab studies, and researchers are looking into potential links to inflammation, digestive issues, and even chronic diseases. But there is currently no established causal link between typical dietary exposures and any specific health outcomes. That said, I think this is a situation where minimizing our exposure makes sense, especially if it's easy to do. Now, you might assume that paper tea bags would be a lot safer, and in many cases they are. But even though you may not see or feel any plastic, they may still be sealed with a thin layer of plastic polymer, like polypropylene. Some of these tea bags are treated with epichlorohydrin, and that's a chemical that's used to keep that bag from falling apart when it's stewing in hot water. Unfortunately, it is also classified as a probable carcinogen. And then there are bleaching agents, which are used in paper processing and may leave behind trace residues of dioxins. Now, all of that sounds pretty alarming, I'll grant you. But as the toxicologists are always reminding us, it's the dose that makes the poison. If these compounds are present at all, it is in very small amounts. Then again, if you're drinking multiple cups of tea every day, even small exposures can add up over time. And finally, I want to talk about heavy metals, but here the concern is not so much the packaging or the tea bags, but the tea itself. The tea plant has a natural tendency to absorb minerals and metals from the soil that it's grown in, including some that we might prefer not to find in our cup, such as lead, aluminum, and cadmium. And these elements accumulate in the tea leaves, and then they leach into our tea when we're brewing it. A 2013 analysis of commercial teas found that several products exceeded recommended lead limits, especially if they were steeped for longer than 3 minutes. And steeping time also affects how much aluminum might end up in the tea. And while most teas stayed within limits for other metals like cadmium and mercury, the potential for long-term accumulation still raises some concerns, especially for high-volume tea drinkers. And this is especially relevant during pregnancy, when even relatively small exposures to heavy metals like lead could affect fetal development. So if you're pregnant, or even you just drink a whole lot of tea, it's worth being a bit more mindful of what you're drinking and how you're preparing it. And we'll get back to that in just a moment. Herbal teas, technically called tisanes, can also contain trace levels of heavy metals, by the way, but the levels found in herbal teas are generally quite low and they rarely exceed health-based safety limits. So the real concern here is with actual tea. So far, we've been talking about the potential hazards of toxic chemical exposure from tea or tea bags and the degree of actual risk they might represent. Before we get into strategies for how we might minimize those exposures, I want to zoom out for a moment, because when it comes to evaluating whether something is good or bad for us, it's never only about what that food contains. It's also about what role it plays in our overall diet and lifestyle, as well as what it might be replacing. So if sipping a cup of tea in the evening helps you wind down instead of reaching for a second glass of wine, or maybe it satisfies your desire for something in place of a sugary dessert, well, those are trade-offs that might matter. Those choices have real impacts on your overall dietary pattern and your health trajectory, and they're not captured in a chemical analysis. And let's not forget that tea itself comes with a long list of health benefits. Decades of research have linked regular tea consumption with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, improved metabolic markers, and in some cases, even cognitive protection. And many of these benefits are thought to come from the antioxidants and the other beneficial phytochemicals found in tea leaves. And those are compounds that remain intact, whether you're brewing them from a bag or you are steeping loose tea leaves. So I'm not saying that we should just totally ignore these concerns, but rather than swear off tea altogether, here are a few small tweaks and adjustments that can help you continue to enjoy tea while minimizing any risk. Number 1, keep an eye on your steeping time. If you're concerned about heavy metals, this is a really simple and effective change that you can make. Limiting your steeping time to 3 minutes or less can significantly reduce your exposure, sometimes by as much as 50%. And cold brewing your tea, such as for iced tea, is likely to also reduce the amount of heavy metals that leach into the tea, even though your brewing time is going to be longer. The fact that you're not exposing it to hot water offsets that. Second tip, avoid squeezing or reheating your tea bags. So squeezing the tea bag, and I'll have to admit, I do this all the time, or leaving it in your cup while you put your cup in the microwave to heat or reheat your tea. Both of those things can increase the release of both microplastics and metals. So best practice here, once your tea has steeped, remove the bag, don't squeeze it, just throw it away without wringing it out. And don't put that tea bag back in the microwave. And then the third tip is to look for brands that use plastic-free tea bags. And a few brands that you might recognize include Puka. They use unbleached paper tea bags and they stitch them with organic cotton thread, so there's no plastic there. Another brand is Clipper. These bags are sealed with a plant-based material instead of polypropylene. Traditional medicinals, they use tea bags that are made from abaca. This is a type of banana plant fiber and wood pulp, so there's no plastic components there. And also Numi teas, they use compostable bags that don't have any plastic sealing material. Now, I just want to say that this is a relatively newly recognized issue, and I would imagine that many brands may still be in the process of updating their materials or switching to safer options. So keep an eye on packaging labels and company websites. They're going to have the most current information. But even if a brand isn't on the list I just gave you today, they may well be taking steps in the right direction. And then the last tip is consider switching to loose leaf tea. If you're using loose tea, it eliminates the packaging concerns altogether. You're not going to be running into any plastic sealants or chemical treatments, no microplastics from the bag itself. And loose tea also tends to be higher quality and give you better flavor. So just use a stainless steel or glass or ceramic teapot and infuser to get your best results there. Now, to close, I just want to stress that for most people, especially if you're drinking 1 or 2 cups a day, the risks appear to be quite low already. But if you're pregnant, or you drink large quantities of tea, or hey, you just want to minimize any unnecessary exposures when it's easy to do, the strategies that I've just outlined are a relatively low effort and high impact way to reduce your exposure to these chemicals of concern. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, you can email me at nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. And if you'd like to find out about having me speak at your conference or live or virtual event, you can learn more at wellnessworkshere.com. Nutrition Diva is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Holly Hutchings is our director of podcasts. Steve Riekeberg is our audio engineer. Morgan Christensen heads up podcast operations and advertising. Thanks also to Nat Hoops. And most of all, thanks to you for listening.